Hello, everyone. Steve Persch here, Director of Technical Marketing at Pantheon. I'm standing here at Decoupled Days 2022. I'm with Kyle Mathews, co-founder, creator of Gatsby. Kyle, you gave a great presentation yesterday, sort of reframing Gatsby's position in the web ecosystem. Could you summarize? This is a big question, but the state of the web ecosystem. Yeah, the state of the web ecosystem now and Gatsby's place in it.
Yeah. So our talk yesterday, it kind of was like zooming out, saying, okay, so there's this huge shift from sort of LAMP stack to cloud and from monolithic architectures where everything you need to run a CMS site is within sort of the walls of a single application like Drupal or WordPress or the 1,000 enterprise CMS and so forth. And it's kind of like it's sort of this like unbundling process where instead of like, okay, we just turn on Drupal and it has everything, we're like, well, okay, we turn Drupal, but we also need these 7 other services. And it's like getting hard to so there's advantages to that, of course, which is like, okay, sweet, like we can just plug and play with all these different things, but then it gets more complicated to manage. And then there's a lot of people who are trying to like, completely unbundle Drupal, where it's like, okay, Drupal's now just like, it's headless and it's already decoupled and it's just like the back end, and we're kind of reproduce everything in sort of this like composable modular way. And so our argument is that like the CMS exists to drop the complexity, to simplify people's lives who are building a particular type of site, which is very common on the internet, which is where you have technical people who need to like design the templates, create custom experiences, and you have like marketing content people who are like actually kind of like running the site and like adding content, doing all sorts of stuff and having their own workflows and whatever. And the CMS kind of like balances those two sometimes competing demands. And sort of compromise between, giving developers full freedom and like marketers full freedom. And sort of like, okay, like let's find a way we can work together. And the CMS like manages that process. But once you go decoupled, it's like everything breaks down and it gets a lot more complicated. And like you can like sort of recreate the CMS, so to speak, in a decoupled world, but it's like very kind of like, it's almost like you have a kit where you're like, okay, like here's a bunch of components, like follow these, 10 pages of instructions, and at the end, you'll maybe have something that's working. You probably won't. You'll give up before then, or you'll get frustrated, or you're like, why did my parents give me this stupid toy, That's kind of the experience a lot of people have going to Decoupled. They're like, this sounds fun and exciting, and then it ends up, tearing their hair out. And so the question, like, we ask is, like, how do we sort of, rebundle? Like, how do we, like, sort of, like, recreate the integrated feel of the CMS, but in sort of this modular world, where you can, like, pull in any piece you want, but it's not this 10 page of instructions get it going, but it's sort of like, point and click. It's kind of like, it was easy as installing a module in Drupal. You're like, I want to install the service, and then it just works.
Sure, and I think one of the difficult parts to navigate here is that a benefit that many teams expect to get from decoupling or chopping off the head of their CMS is a clear line between certain responsibilities happen on this side and then other responsibilities happen on another side. I think part of what you're highlighting, though, is that this whole ecosystem is always in flux, and therefore it might be harder to pin down which things happen on which sides. For Gatsby, what are some areas where you think this is clearly on the side of the diagram that Gatsby is on, and then maybe this other question is clearly outside of Gatsby's responsibility?
Yeah, so I mean, our goal with Gatsby has always been like we've sort of seen this. I started Gatsby in 2015, and I did a lot of like Drupal stuff. The 8 or 9 years before that. My goal is always like with Gatsby is sort of like I was saying, like, kind of like recreate the CMS feel, but in this sort of cloud modular world. And so for us, it's like, a lot of people think of Gatsby as like, oh, it's a React framework, which is part of the story. It's like if you have a back end, you need a front end, and you need like a hosting story. So like those are very like clear things that we've taken responsibility for. But we also have something that a lot of people don't know, which is like this data layer. And the point of the data layer has always been to kind of simplify connecting your front end to the back end. Because there's a lot of problems with the connection part, but like one of the big ones is each backend has its own API. And like getting data out of the backend into your front end is like a big part of building the site. And if you have like 3 different backends, you have to learn 3 different APIs, and they're not compatible. They all have gotchas, and they're all like, weird in their own special, wonderful, beautiful way that the creators thought was interesting, but actually isn't, that's just annoying. So anyway, so it's like what Gatsby does is like, the data layer gives you like a high level API. So you can like query everything in the same way. So you don't have to like learn anything new when you're like, let's do Drupal, WordPress, and Shopify. It's like they all have the same API within Gatsby, which is like a real convenience.
Yeah, I mean, if someone were to just ask me like, what is the differentiator, what is the value of Gatsby, I would think to the idea of the content mesh that you talked about for years, and just from my own experience using Gatsby, having that unification of these multiple data sources come together in an internal GraphQL API, and you maybe don't need to know what's happening behind that because it all gets exposed as a basically consistent GraphQL API. That's a huge value. How much is that evolving? Like, is that a core piece of Gatsby that's staying unchanged, or in the years to come, now that Gatsby is 7 years old, do you want people thinking about that value in a slightly different way at all?
Yeah, I mean we've actually extended. So that's kind of like the original value prop, like high level API. You don't have to learn you don't have to learn these arbitrary backend things. It just sort of works. We've kind of extended the model in some important ways since then, because the idea of a data layer is to create a tight coupling between the backend and the front end. Instead of like a loose coupling where the framework has no idea about the backend, backend has no idea about the front end. There's sort of like information that's like sharing, and that the framework can like do stuff about it. So one of the things that we've added is something we call like content mesh, and this solves like sort of the content workflow problem. So when you have a backend and they typically have like a preview button, like you make a draft change or something, like how will it reflect in the front end? But in a decoupled world, the back end has absolutely no idea about the front end, and the front end has absolutely no idea about the back end. And so Gatsby's data layer solves this problem where we can sort of like say like, oh, actually this little piece of data is used on this page. So when they click preview, we can then just send them to that page. And so that's like a really critical like workflow that the CMS creates, and that with Gatsby and the data layer we can sort of like fix and make work again. Another one is like you mentioned like reactive site generation. So it's like another problem is like sort of like caching of pages. So you make a data change, like you're like, okay, I updated this title. How does that get reflected in sort of the hosted version of the site? And so with the data layer is basically, it's sort of like, you can think of it as like a real-time stream of changes. So you can like get all the previous state, but whenever there's a new change, it's just sort of like, boom, gets streamed in. And so on Gatsby Cloud, we use that sort of like stream of changes, like, okay, like this particular entity in Drupal had a title change, and then we do what's I call like a reactive build, which is like basically say, which page uses that title, and there's like, oh, there's 3 of them. There's like the actual article page, and then it shows up randomly on 2 other pages for one reason or another, and then we're like, okay, those 3 pages now need updated, and then we rebuild them, and it's all like in a second, those pages are updated on the CDN. And that's like something, that sort of like streaming, the data layer gives you that sort of ability to do that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I would recommend anyone watching here read the blog post you published last week that goes in great detail on those different initialisms of rendering, reactive site generation, static site generation, and whatnot, and the pluses and minuses. Now, here we are at day 2 of the conference. Have there been any topics, themes, discussion points that have come up beyond Gatsby that have been particularly interesting to you at the conference?
Yeah, just I think in general, just like, it's like any sort of new movement for better. I mean, movement's not really, that's more of a political thing. But anyways, the technical revolution. Okay. It's also anyways, okay. Whenever like a lot of people are like excited about something, and there's a lot of like change and movement, innovation, the early phases is just sort of borne on by raw hope and like excitement and just sort of like, yeah, we're just like plunging in and solving hard problems. But there's sort of this point where, the momentum slows because you solve the hard problems, but it's still like not, I mean, it's like you've sort of like figured out what needs to be done, but there's still sort of that long stretch of like actually making it as good as the old one. So it's like, okay, you can build a decoupled Drupal site, but it's still pretty painful and it's still confusing. So like, it's sort of like this big gap. And like there's in sort of like the business literature, there's a lot around this too. It's like, crossing the chasm type stuff where it's like, the very early adopters, they don't mind the rough edges, and they're like, sweet, like this is fun. This is like way less boring than all my other projects, so I'm gonna like charge it and do things. But the normal, you know, business unit building a website doesn't like to be exposed to kind of all the risk of adopting a new technology. So the question for sort of decoupled modular web type stuff is like, for Gatsby in general, it is just how do we cross this chasm? How do we make this genuinely exciting, super innovative approach to building websites actually adoptable by normal folks who don't want to be cut up to pieces when they try to adopt this bleeding edge tech.
Yeah, I mean, if you're on the bleeding edge, you might need some Band-Aids. There could be some blood.
Yeah, we need safety razors.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Kyle Mathews, thanks so much for chatting with us here at Decoupled Days 2022. Thanks so much.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.